A wedding in downtown Seattle after 38 hidden years. A sitcom father dying with secrets still locked inside the role. A television legend whose public story was softened until the truth almost disappeared in polite language. That is the fracture inside old TV comfort. The laugh tracks were real. The warmth was real. But so was the silence. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are tonight. Paul Lynde. America remembered Paul Lynde as the acid-sweet uncle, the center-square assassin, the man who could drop a line and leave a studio shaking. On Bewitched and Hollywood squares, he seemed impossible to miss. That was the trick. He was visible everywhere, yet the truth about him remained officially unspoken. Television loved the energy, the arch delivery, the camp timing. It did not love honesty. During Lynde's lifetime, the media mostly avoided naming what many viewers sensed. Even a 1976 People profile softened the edges with euphemisms instead of direct language. But that public fog had a cost. His persona made him marketable, while his actual life stayed fenced off behind implication, gossip, and fear. Wait, that is what makes Lynde's story hurt. He was not hidden because he lacked visibility. He was hidden in plain sight. The industry could cash the checks, air the jokes, and let middle America enjoy the flavor, so long as nobody asked the final question out loud. In him, television found a profitable contradiction. The performance was welcome, but the person still had to arrive, disguised. He made suspicion feel safe for viewers and danger feel private for himself. Even now, his legacy feels like a warning about fame purchased through denial. Jim Nabors became beloved as Gomer Pyle, a character so gentle and harmless that he felt built for America's safest living rooms. His voice, his innocence, his softness, everything about the image promised comfort. But the deeper truth of his life lived elsewhere, in privacy and endurance. Nabors spent decades with Stan Cadwallader, a former Honolulu firefighter, long before the public got a legal milestone to attach to the story. In January 2013, when Nabors was 82, the two married at the Fairmont Olympic Hotel in downtown Seattle after Washington state legalized same-sex marriage. That detail matters. Not because a wedding suddenly created the relationship, but because it exposed how much life had already passed in silence. 38 years together? 38. Television had long benefited from the warmth of his image, while the culture around him gave that private reality little room to breathe in public. But Nabors never turned the story into spectacle. He framed it simply, almost modestly, as holding on to a good friend. That restraint says everything. For some stars of his era, survival meant learning how to make a life real without making it publicly legible, until history finally changed around them. The tenderness stayed public. The permission arrived decades late. He survived by staying gentle and unreadable. Raymond Burr, projected authority. As Perry Mason and later Ironside, he looked like a man built from certainty, command, and masculine control. Viewers trusted him because he seemed unshakable. Yet his off-screen life was handled with far more caution than the characters he played. Burr's long relationship with Robert Benavides began around 1960, and the two built a life that stretched far beyond a passing Hollywood companionship. They worked together, shared businesses, and became connected to a vineyard in Sonoma County. Here's the twist. The issue was not absence. It was management. The bond was real. The life was real. What changed was the vocabulary the public thought it could tolerate. Burr died in 1993 near Healdsburg, California. By then, the old studio reflex still lingered. Protect the star image by sanding down the human facts. That is why his story feels so revealing. Television could sell certainty, strength, and mature authority to millions. But when that same authority belonged to a man sharing his life with another man, the culture reached for euphemism. Not truth. Euphemism. And euphemism is often just fear wearing a silk tie. Robert Reed, maybe the cruelest example in this entire story. To millions, he was Mike Brady. the civilized father at the center of one of television's most durable family fantasies. He represented reassurance, order, and emotional safety between 1969 and 1974. America invited him into the living room as the ideal dad, but the role that made him immortal also tightened the cage around him. Later accounts from friends and co-stars described Reed as a man suffering under the pressure of a double life in an era when public exposure could have damaged both the show and his career. That context matters because it changes the way the image plays. He was not simply private. He was trapped inside a national symbol. Reed died at Huntington Memorial Hospital in Pasadena on May 12, 1992. After his death, public reporting widened, including the disclosure that he had been HIV positive while also battling colon lymphoma. Wait, look at the emotional shape of that. The actor who played America's most acceptable father moved through his final chapter carrying private burdens the culture had trained him to hide. Television loved the stability of Mike Brady. It had no real plan for the truth of Robert Reed. And that gap is where the tragedy lives. George Takei belongs in this story because his life shows both the old fear and the later break from it. For years, many actors of his generation understood the rule without needing it spoken. Protect the career, protect the image, do not volunteer the truth. Takei knew that system well. Then history shifted, and so did he. In 2005, after California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger vetoed a same-sex marriage bill, Takei publicly came out and linked his own story to political activism. 3 years later, after California briefly opened marriage to same-sex couples, he and Brad Altman became one of the first couples to apply for a license in West Hollywood. They married in Los Angeles on September 14, 2008. But what gives his chapter power is not just visibility. It is timing. He had already lived so much of life under older rules. So when he finally stepped fully into public truth, it felt less like a celebrity confession than a verdict on the era that made secrecy seem necessary. But even his courage throws a shadow backward. It reminds us how many years performers lost to fear, caution, and professional calculation. Takei's later openness is inspiring. It is also an indictment of the system that made such openness feel dangerous for so long. Charles Nelson Reilly was one of television's great paradoxes. He was flamboyant, funny, unmistakable, and entirely himself in ways audiences could see without needing them formally explained. On Match Game, on talk shows, on variety television, he turned wit into a signature. The public enjoyed the style. The industry enjoyed the ratings. But acceptance had limits. Reilly's visibility was often treated as entertainment first and identity second, which is another way of saying the culture liked coded queerness better than declared queerness. That distinction matters. It meant a performer could be celebrated for the signals while still being denied the dignity of straightforward recognition. Reilly spent decades with his partner Patrick Hughes, who later spoke publicly after Reilly's death in 2007. There is something heartbreaking in that timing. A life can be legible to everyone in the room and still remain only half-named in the public script. Here's the twist. Reilly did not fit the closet in the old dramatic sense. He fit a more television-shaped version of it. He could be obvious, beloved, profitable, and still held at a careful distance from full acknowledgement. That is why his story feels so sharp. Sometimes the industry does not erase you. Sometimes it laughs with you, books you, and still refuses to say plainly who you are. Dick Sargent gave television one of its most familiar suburban husbands when he took over the role of Darren Stevens on Bewitched. The image was easy to sell. Neat, likable, husband-shaped, harmless. Yet Sargent's real significance reaches beyond the sitcom itself. On National Coming Out Day in 1991, he publicly declared that he was gay and tied that honesty to the pain young gay people were carrying. He reportedly joked about becoming a retroactive role model, but the phrase lands because it is funny and sad at the same time. He came out after decades in an industry that taught men like him to separate career from truth. Then, in 1992, he served as a Grand Marshal of the Los Angeles Gay Pride Parade alongside Elizabeth Montgomery. That image matters, not because it erases the years of silence, but because it transforms them into witness. But, even here, the victory is bittersweet. Sargent died in 1994 of prostate cancer at 64, so the public chapter of honesty was brief. That is part of what makes his story moving. He did eventually speak plainly. He did offer himself to younger people as proof that shame was not the only ending. But he also reminds us how late honesty often arrived for television men shaped by older fear. Richard Deacon, specialized in polished irritation. On The Dick Van Dyke Show and Leave It to Beaver, he played authority figures who looked proper, clipped, and fully under control. He understood how to make stiffness funny. That was his gift. And because he played order so well, his own off-screen reserve feels even more telling in hindsight. The public record around Deacon's private life is thinner than it is for some others in this story. And that thinness should be respected. What can be said more safely is that he never turned his personal life into a public narrative, and later accounts have often treated that silence itself as part of the historical pattern surrounding closeted performers in mid-century television. Wait, that matters. Sometimes survival leaves fewer dramatic facts because the strategy was not scandal or confession. It was containment. Deacon died in August 1984 after an apparent heart attack. Even his obituary focused on craft, credits, and the familiar face viewers knew. Perhaps that is fitting. He belonged to a generation for whom being careful could feel like professionalism, self-protection, and loneliness all at once. His story does not scream. It tightens. And in that tightness, you can still feel the era, a world where privacy was not always freedom, but often the price of remaining employed, respectable, and unexamined. Billy DeWolfe came from an older Hollywood tradition, the era of polished mannerisms, precise diction, and supporting characters who could steal a scene simply by sounding more refined than everyone around them. He built a career playing fussy, fastidious men in films and television, from Paramount comedies to The Doris Day Show, and even the voice of Professor Hinkle in Frosty the Snowman. Audiences recognized the elegance immediately. So did the industry. But that kind of elegance could function two ways at once. It could become a marketable signature, and it could become a mask broad enough for the public to consume without forcing a direct conversation about the man behind it. The public record around DeWolfe's sexuality is not as fully documented as it is for some later figures, so caution matters here. Still, his place in this story comes from how old Hollywood handled performers whose style read as coded long before mainstream media wanted direct language. Here's the twist. Coded visibility did not begin in the 1970s. It was already there in earlier decades, wrapped in polish, wit, and theatrical precision. DeWolfe died in Los Angeles in 1974 after a long career of memorable supporting turns. His story leaves behind a familiar old Hollywood lesson. Sometimes the persona is not just branding, it is shelter with applause attached. Wayland Flowers closes this list because his act almost explains the whole system by itself. He created Madam, the outrageous puppet who could say what polite television usually would not. That was the genius. The dummy could be filthy, sharp, vain, and brazen in ways that would have sounded riskier coming directly from the man holding her. Flowers became a mainstream success after building the act in clubs, and many later writers have seen Madame as a kind of pressure valve, a performer's wit, nerve, and coded social knowledge thrown safely into another mouth. But safety had limits. Flowers was never simply a novelty act. He was a man navigating the same entertainment economy that often welcomed queer style more easily than queer candor. In September 1988, after collapsing on stage earlier that month at Harrah's in Lake Tahoe, he died in Los Angeles at 48 from complications tied to AIDS-related Kaposi's sarcoma. That fact lands hard because the era itself lands hard. By the late 1980s, silence was no longer only about reputation. It was entangled with fear, stigma, and death. Madame could say almost anything. Wayland Flowers still had to live in a world that punished too much truth from the wrong mouth. That contradiction makes his story feel funny, fearless, and devastating all at once. Television loved their timing, wit, and coded sparkle. It often feared the truth that produced them. Do you think Hollywood protected these men, or profited from their silence? Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and hit the bell for more untold stories.